Hey there, this is Justin Hampton for another CompTool Tuesday. For those of you that don't know or have not seen a CompTool Tuesday, it is where myself and sometimes, preferably those times, we will have another compensation practitioner guest join us to kind of talk shop about what's going on in the week, about all things compensation. So we like to pull things that we've heard in the news, things that we've seen on professional forums, things we've heard on LinkedIn, things we've heard from clients, and kind of really just give a rundown and kind of talk shop about those things. So this week, it's been a quieter week in the news than the previous week. Last week, there was a good bit of news about the New York pay transparency laws and how those have been suspended until November 1st. But starting November 1st, we will start seeing that those pay ranges are included in all job postings from within the city of New York. We're going to see those laws continue to expand and grow. We will see it taking place in Washington State, January 1st of 2023. Which is, that's pretty exciting when you think of some of the larger companies that are there, where you've got your Microsoft and your Amazons, and there's a lot of Facebook, Google presence there as well. And I really do think we're going to continue to see these grow in prevalence, which is one of the really nice things about our tool Squirrel, which aggregates and compiles that data. So, we had a little bit of that going on, but I think as that has really started to take shape and we started to see more and more companies doing that, but also lots of companies that are really starting to still kind of have challenges with that remote work environment. We've had some questions around, and I've seen some questions on forums pop up around, what are we doing versus a national structure versus a geographically informed structure? This one to me is a question that sometimes surprises me at, if we need to, what are the pros and cons of having a national structure versus one that's geographically informed? Well, I would say the answer to that is try to hire someone in San Francisco or New York at a national structure. There's a really good chance that's not going to be a very successful recruiting strategy. I do think that we really need to, consider the things that are the drivers of what people are paid. And part of that is the job. Another part of that is labor market. There's a lot of other things included too when we set individual pay or we set pay for particular jobs. But I don't think that we can ignore the cost of labor markets where people sit and just set a national structure. One of the things I typically recommend that folks do to help manage that, though, is the same thing that we've done for decades with no controversy, or at least limited controversy, and that is to just use the same approach as you would use for a shift differential. A shift differential and a geographic differential are pretty much the same thing. You've got two people doing the same exact job. One of them is doing it at night, one of them is doing it during the day, and there is a difference in pay. Same as a geographic structure or a geographic differential. You've got two people doing the same job. One is in Kansas, one is in San Francisco. You're paying them differently based on the cost of labor markets. But the key difference, I think, it's really communicating that change, because I think employees rightfully are going to ask, well, if I work in Kansas, the delivery or the goods and services I'm providing to the company are the same as if I were sitting in San Francisco. So why is my pay decreased? And I do think that we as compensation practitioners can actually decouple those two things from an employee's pay. And that would just require us to, work with our HRS or our payroll team to essentially set up a line item in employee pay stubs where you've got, here's what the job is worth at the national average. And here's what, based on where you live, what that job is worth on top of that. So I think that's a pretty easy way to manage the geographic structures with folks being completely remote. And when it comes down to, what do we pay for, these little towns or very hard to find locations that are hard to find market data for, I go back to, the market data is directional and it's not perfect, especially when you get to small towns or areas where there's just not a high prevalence of market data. Again, compensation is a blend of art and science, which we all know. And if you're not able to find that market data, there's potentially a good reason for that. It could be because there's just not that much data in that particular location, or it's not a high volume job. And so I think really to think about how we are pricing ourselves competitively, we have to really kind of weigh in, the high sample size from surveys and the degree of accuracy from very specific labor markets. And sometimes those things aren't always one and the same. And so typically what I recommend is creating, cost of labor differentials at a higher level. So, I don't necessarily recommend you to have a 13% differential for New York City and a 15% differential for San Francisco. I would say for the most part, we can lump those and categorize those into high cost of labor, ultra high cost of labor markets, and differentiate our geodiffs by 5% buckets based on the different locations, different labor markets that we have within. And so those are kind of my general thoughts on that. I've actually got a paper published with World at Work. It's called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's, it's out there on the World at Work. It's out there on our blog to go and review. It's, managing a distributed workforce, I believe is what we titled that. It's got a lot of tips and tricks around kind of how do you pay folks across the U.S. I think another question too that came up on one of the World at Work forums was, how are you using, what data cuts are you using? And I do think that we as compensation practitioners have a habit of looking at specific market data cuts, whether they are industry or revenue or headcount. But again, I would kind of recommend a little bit of caution, a little bit of, consider what you are doing when you look at smaller data sets, because you may find that with that smaller data set, you are removing a number of very potential competitors from your labor pool, and you're not considering those. So one of the stories I always like to tell is I worked for a company. It's a small tech, not a startup, a small tech company in San Francisco. We had about under 1,000 employees, and we weren't going to compare ourselves to Facebook at the discretion, at the advisement of leadership, because we can't afford to compete with Facebook or Amazon. Well, the problem with that was Facebook sure didn't mind competing with us. So by ignoring the actual labor market that we were competing with, we had some of our jobs, I wouldn't say underpriced, but we were not as competitive as we could have been. Of course, we were aligned to the market, which is what you have to be. But at the end of the day, Facebook ended up taking about half of our recruiting staff and paying them about 2x. But again, there's nothing we could have done with that. We weren't going to double rates of pay. I mean, that would have created many internal equity challenges. It would have been financially irresponsible and misaligned to our compensation philosophy. But there were things that we could have done otherwise to prevent folks from starting to look in the first place. I think that's just really one thing to consider when you look at those different labor markets or those different labor cuts. Make sure you're not cutting out folks that are actually, very much in your labor pool that you are competing for talent with, whether it's industry or revenue or headcount size. Just because you fall into one of those buckets doesn't mean your competitors are going to ignore you from another one. Talent is talent, and a lot of times the biggest driver or the biggest commonality is it within driving distance, though that has changed significantly over the last 18 or 24 months. So a couple other things that have come up is people are really kind of curious in terms of, with inflation at 8, 9, 37%, whatever it is now. I think it was 8.9% was the highest number that I saw. People are really kind of asking, what's everyone doing to manage the high rates of inflation for your staff? It's been a really strange, right now, back in March, more people quit their jobs in the US than ever before. Ever. And right now, this is the highest rate of inflation that we've had in the last 40 plus years. And on top of that, right now there are fewer job seekers than there are jobs. The fewest number of job seekers compared to the number of jobs as there's ever been. So from a comp perspective, it's very interesting because there are more people quitting their jobs. There are fewer job seekers, and inflation is really kind of pushing up, competitive rates of pay. So what do we as compensation people do? Well, 41% of us are doing nothing. No, we had a poll asking, what are you doing to manage inflation? And the options were healthy merit adjustments, healthy market adjustments, one-time spot bonuses or stipends, or nothing at all. I was actually surprised by this. 41% of the folks that responded to this, and there were about over 300 compensation practitioners that responded to this, 41% said they were doing nothing at all to manage inflation. 32% said they had higher than normal merit budgets, and 23% said they had were making market adjustments, and only 3% suggest they were doing spot bonuses or stipends, which to me is probably not the approach I would take. Spot bonuses are one-time payments, whereas inflation is a permanent add. So a spot bonus doesn't seem like the appropriate way to take care of that, because what are you spotting? Really quite different. A couple other things too. I saw one of the forums out there, someone was asking for great places to find competitive labor market data. I believe it was a smaller company looking for some budget-friendly salary survey data. And we have it's comptool.com/affordable-salary-surveys, comptool.com affordable salary surveys. And we've got a list of, I think there's 8 or 10 employer-reported salary surveys that are all under $3,000 a year. But I think the reason I wanted to bring this up was because as comp practitioners, it's important to be careful with the information you receive from folks online, especially in different forums when people can post anonymously. In this particular forum, someone suggested just pick up the phone and call your competitors and find out what they're paying people. I strongly recommend against that. Now, it is true, someone else stated that, to violate antitrust rules, you have to collude to fix wages and prices. But I would challenge that's to say that, just because you don't set out to do that doesn't mean that you have not inadvertently put your company at risk for an audit and doing such. Because if you think of the natural way conversations happen, if I were to call up one of my competitors and ask them, what are you paying for your software engineer roles? And let's say they say, yeah, we're paying 85 to 95K, or we're paying on average, 97K, whatever it might be. The next natural question they're going to ask you is, well, what about you? And, as soon as you answer that, now you've kind of exchanged that information. And, subconsciously or even consciously, depending on what we do with that information now that we've collected it, that can put our employer at risk. At nothing else, it definitely puts us at a greater risk for an audit. Doesn't necessarily mean there would be a finding or that we would have broken antitrust rules, but I promise that is probably not a situation that you nor your company would want to go through and have to, prove that you had not set to fix wages or collude. So I would leave that kind of research out of the phones and kind of making direct contact, and continue to follow your safe harbor guidelines, which are managing your salary surveys through third-party data or third-party, making sure the data is anonymous, making sure the data is old, and that's specifically when we are talking about actual salary rates, not intent to pay, which is kind of salary postings, which is where the data from Squirrel comes from. So they are two different things. But I would really just kind of strongly advise against picking up the phone and calling your competitors to find out what they are paying. Whether or not you do collude, I don't think most folks probably would not intentionally do such a thing. But, well, that is, I don't even know how to turn that off. Let's see, is that one? Oh, the joy of doing things live. There we go. There we go. But yeah, so just a couple other quick notes is I will be in Tampa at Disrupt HR speaking about why your data is right and wrong at the same time. That is coming up on May 19th. So we're really looking forward to working with the Living HR team to kind of help be a speaker for that. So we're really honored and really appreciate the opportunity. And then I will be at the World at Work conference on May 21st through the 25th, I believe, or 22nd through the 25th, speaking about how do we stay competitive even when the data doesn't tell us we are. So, if you are at either of these conferences, it would be great for you to reach out. Really look forward to seeing you. And until then, this has been a CompTool Tuesday, and I will see you all again next Tuesday. Thanks so much.